as you can see up there, I work in New South Wales Health. So I can finally get to say in front of an audience like this, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. It's one of my many roles. Look, one of the things you heard from Ian, Ian spends a lot of his time working with rats and test tubes. David spoke about some of the issues involved in doing some of the clinical trials that people have been calling for. I want to spend just a small amount of time talking about, and what does all that mean? What does that actually mean in terms of once you've done with your test tubes and your clinical trials, what does it actually mean in terms of how you translate that into practice such that individuals who need access to treatment can get it? What are some of the key issues? Just a quick disclaimer, I've got no financial interest regarding cannabis-related research, but I have been funded by Benkaiser. They're a manufacturer of buprenorphine, and that's an opioid medication for opioid treatments. I spent a lot of my early career actually looking at the development of new treatments for opioid dependence, including setting up trials of heroin prescribing in the UK. So, have a long history of trying to get our heads around what does it mean to play with these kinds of medications, do research on medications, and then develop these into treatments that then get introduced into clinical practice. And that includes how do you write guidelines for doctors? How do you develop education programs for doctors so that they use these new treatments? How do you develop consumer information, just as important as clinical guidelines? All right, what I basically want to talk about is where do we want to be and how do we get there in this whole arena around medical cannabis? And then quickly touch on just what can you legitimately expect from the medical community in Australia. We've heard some comments about, doctors aren't going to do this and aren't going to do that, and you're right, most of them won't. But what can we legitimately expect? The one thing I kind of also just really, it's really clear when you come to a forum like this, when you listen to political debates in Parliament, when you read reports, when you listen to media, when you get a group of doctors sitting around talking to each other, that often there's different issues being spoken about. That often we're not all on the same page when we're talking about what do we mean by medical cannabis. So the easiest thing to define is we're talking around pharmaceutical medications. These are medications made by drug companies, licensed by drug companies, prescribed by doctors, dispensed by pharmacies. This is the mainstream Western model. Sativex is an example of a pharmaceutical cannabinoid medication. And as was pointed out, Sativex actually comes from the plant, unlike the synthetic THC products such as Marinol or Dronabinol. Irrespective of that, even Dronabinol or Marinol is an example of a pharmaceutical medication. So that's good old-fashioned Western medicine. Then we often, and a lot of the stories we've been hearing in the last 2 days, is the idea of the use of plant-based products by people for the management of their medical conditions. Now, Western medicine usually doesn't do this particularly well, but there's a lot of this going on in Australia already. Australians actually spend as much in terms of, look at when people have been surveyed, actually look at what do Australians spend their money on. Australians overall spend about as much as a consumer, as individuals, we spend as much on alternative therapies as we do on traditional Western medicine. So there's a long history in Australia of Australians turning to naturopaths, acupuncturists, homeopaths. So this is a thriving industry within Australia. And much of what we've been hearing about is kind of like a subterranean version of that. And then there's the issue of what some people have called recreational cannabis use, and there's a problem with the term recreational because it makes it sound as though it's the kind of thing you do sipping on a pina colada by the pool, but that's not necessarily the full extent of what gets called recreational cannabis use. It's difficult to define what do we mean by this recreational cannabis use. And I like to kind of think of it as people that are using cannabis for its intoxicating or psychoactive effects. I would argue that those bottom two often can overlap. In some cases, they're very distinct. So there are some people that want their access to medical cannabis, preferably without any intoxicating effects, never smoked a joint or a bong in their lives, and they are looking for the healing properties of cannabis without any intoxicating effects. There are other people that just like getting stoned. Then there's also quite a lot of people for whom the intoxication of cannabis can actually be acting as a therapeutic agent. So we're talking about grey zones here. It's pretty easy to identify people at either extreme, but gee, there's a lot of grey in between. And one of the things that, in order for us to be able to move forward and to stop sort of having a go at each other, because I think, one of the easiest sort of ways of derailing a movement is if we start turning on each other rather than uniting and being clear that we all have a voice and that we all should be working towards, recognising that different people need different things. So I've kind of tried to think about, could you identify a framework that, look, there are different things going on if you're talking about recreational users, those individuals who want natural therapy, sort of a natural therapy approach, if I can just use that term, and then the issue of pharmaceutical medications. So if you just look at those, and I would argue that, again, the recreational use and the natural therapy, that's a continuum. Easy to identify people at either end, but, as we're saying, there's a continuum in between. And in terms of how do we move forward, what Dave just spoke about is what do we have to do that bottom line, the pharmaceutical medications. And he's just walked you through a somewhat tedious, laborious process that is required to get the kinds of evidence required to license a medication with the TGA. And he didn't even mention about the even more important issue, or not more important, but just as important, is what do you need to do to then get a medication on the free list or actually subsidised? Because something like Sativex is pretty expensive, but you know what? We use far more expensive drugs in Australia all the time. I don't hear anyone complaining about, gee, statins are really expensive and maybe we shouldn't be using them. Because, actually, we wouldn't need to be prescribing statins. The single most expensive medication in Australia is a class of drugs called statins. What are statins for? Largely because Australians don't like exercising and eating well. So, when it comes to, too expensive, we shouldn't be wasting our money on Sativex, well, why not? We waste our money on much less important medications. So this idea around, it's too expensive, actually, I think is a bit of a furphy. If a medication works and you can demonstrate that it is cost effective, and that's the key, you must show in your clinical trials and your randomised studies cost efficacy, i.e., it actually saves the community more to treat people than to not treat them. And there's a way of doing this. It's not as though, how would you do this? It's really clear for researchers such as Dave and myself, this is what we do all the time. The other thing about evidence I want to comment upon, we just heard a wonderful presentation this morning from Mara Gordon, which was really going through and sort of talking around how do you tailor this big world of medical cannabis. You know what, it's not all the same. Different conditions need different approaches. And how about her description around doses? Because often when we talk about we need evidence for a medication, often what that means is, what do you need to get a drug license, to get it over the line? That's when the real work starts about developing your evidence about how do we use it. As a doctor, I need to know, how long am I going to prescribe this for? What dose? I need to be able to talk to my patients around, and the side effects of this duration of medication for this dose is going to go. These are the kinds of issues that for which we need ongoing evidence for. Evidence doesn't stop the day you get a drug licensed. In many respects, that's the beginning of a journey about the collection of evidence, because it's about how do you refine treatments to make them work better. So, evidence, we can talk about evidence, but what do we need evidence for? We only need this level of rigour for evidence if we are talking around pharmaceutical medications. Who's that going to be relevant for? That's going to be relevant for those people that want their cannabinoids prescribed by a doctor, dispensed by a pharmacist. And whilst there are many people in this room that actually don't want to go to a doctor, we also need to appreciate that actually probably for a large proportion of Australians, they aren't going to go anywhere near cannabinoids unless a doctor has prescribed for them. So we actually need to be thinking, yep, we can move on those top frameworks, but we also need to be developing the bottom framework. It often takes us longer, but this isn't about one model is going to sort our problems. We actually need to think, how do we move there? So the pharmaceutical medications, doctors, pharmacists prescribing for those patients that want a doctor to prescribe it for them. That's the kind of evidence we need, those big RCTs of safety and efficacy. We need health economics. We can also do other really clever study designs. All those individual cases easily turned into studies. The documentary that Zach Stein showed yesterday, that just how powerful was it, seeing the patient, the Parkinsonian patient using cannabis and then removal of tremor. That's just a undocumented clinical trial. And that is a clinical trial. All you've got to do is set it up in such a way you can actually document properly, and bang, you've got evidence. So not all studies need to necessarily take 5 years. There's a lot we can do with much cleverer designs that don't require 200, 300, 400 patients. And indeed, for some of the disorders we're talking about, we're never going to get 400 patients into a study. Doesn't mean we can't get evidence. We can, we just got to think about cleverer ways. But it is going to take us time to develop that. In the meantime, what are our options? Well, some of the options is you can actually move to the recreational and natural therapies much, much, much faster. What do you need to do to be able to address the issue of recreational cannabis use? Well, that's largely about our laws, decriminalisation and or legalisation. They're different issues. And there are, governments around the world have done that from time to time, and there's ways of progressing that argument. Then there's that whole issue of the natural therapies. And the natural therapies can be for those who want to access cannabis for their medical conditions, preferably don't really want to be going to doctors. And, we've got a whole health industry already, well situated in this field. People that go to naturopaths, acupuncturists, all those herbalists, that's active now in Australia. Would it be possible to think of a way forward to make medical cannabis products that within that framework? Absolutely. I think the bill that Richard Di Natale was describing actually moves us a long way forward along those lines, partly because it takes it out of the hands of the politicians. Probably the most important thing we have to do. Now, the thing about again, do you need doctors involved? Do you need the letter from the doctor that I'm suffering from such and such? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. We can work on those details later. More importantly, what do you need in terms of a regulatory framework? Well, what you need is what Mara Gordon was talking about. We need quality control. You need standards. In the same way, people saying, treat it like a food. Even food has standards, guys. The milk you buy in the shop has got standards. Believe me, it does. The wheat that farmers grow that goes into our bread is all done under standards. So this idea that, you don't need standards, actually you do if you want some form of quality control and consistency. If you want to grow your own weed in your backyard and, a little local network of, I do it for my 5 mates, that's fine, and, good luck to you if you want to do that. But if we're talking about reaching large numbers of individuals, we've done some work looking at chronic pain and cannabis use. We can estimate probably a demand of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Australians who have indicated they would like to use medical cannabis for their chronic pain treatment. Now, we're not going to get 10 to 30,000 Australians growing their own weed. Well, maybe you would, but the kinds of patients who most want or need these medications are not necessarily going to be growing their own weed. Some will, but many won't. And many will. And if they will and want to, good luck to them. But we also need to think about how do those people that for one reason or other are not into growing their own cannabis, how do they access it? And that's where some of these issues around, how do you make sure you've got some quality standards and controls? The level of evidence there largely is a buyer beware model. There is no evidence around cupping. Well, let me reframe that. There is evidence for cupping. But if someone wants to go to a Chinese therapist and engage in cupping, it's a buyer beware model. And, within this framework of natural therapies, that's the way that whole industry has largely been developed. And I can't see any other way of, I think it would be wrong to start thinking about how do you regulate with an evidence base those natural therapy approaches. So that's a way of thinking. Now, I actually think we need probably all three of these approaches. It's not about which is the right one, because different patients have different needs. People have different needs, and different people are going to access these in different ways. Some are going to take us longer to get there than others. So that's sort of, how do we position this debate, and how do we work together so that, we're not having one group who are keen to promote, say, the recreational or the natural, attacking the people that are doing Sativex studies. Look, we need them all, and we all need to be working together and learning from each other. Which brings us to, once you've got these products available, what can you expect from the medical community? Now, I am a doctor, and I spend a lot of my time trying to work with doctors to practice in an area of medicine that overall they've never been educated about and largely don't want to know about and distrust this patient group. I'm talking about drug and alcohol patients. So individuals with alcohol problems, heroin problems, amphetamine problems, to a lesser degree cannabis problems. So that's what I've been doing for 20 years. And how do you get doctors to get engaged? And overall I can say most don't and most won't. But that's okay, because you don't need every doctor, you just need enough. One thing we need to appreciate, we have a privatised health system in Australia. Other than a handful of doctors that work in hospitals, our doctors are all little private practitioners. Medicare is just a way of subsidising them to run private practices. We do not have an NHS, like in the UK, where the government can tell the doctors, you will do this kind of medicine. That happens in the NHS. In Australia, that's not what we got. Every GP can decide what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. Some GPs do acupuncture, most don't. There is an evidence base, stuff works, but most don't go there. And that's a reality. In Australian medical practice, most doctors are not going to get involved in medical cannabis treatments, and this is what we're hearing from Israel, from other parts of the world. Let's accept that. Doesn't mean we can't improve things. I'll hurry up. People are uncomfortable doing things that they aren't trained to do, and that goes against their grain. This isn't just doctors, it's all of us. And we have to appreciate, when we're talking about the natural therapies, doctors know very little, and it's not what they do. And so we need to think, how do you move them forward? We can expect very poor or low uptake, almost no uptake for the natural therapy models, and we can expect poor uptake, maybe a little bit more for pharmaceutical models in the first place. But things can change over time. To make things change, this is what you need. You need your evidence. It's not just those big studies that we're talking about. We need the role of key opinion leaders and organisations within medicine. Very importantly, in this day and age, patient feedback and consumer movements are really important in the way medicine is moving. Do not underestimate just the power that consumer movements have and consumer organisations. It's something that needs to be mobilised. The logistics of practice. If a drug ain't on a free list, doctors don't often prescribe it because they know most of their patients can't afford it. We need to normalise and destigmatise all issues around substance use, not just cannabis, but one of the things that is driving the cannabinoid phobia that this society has is that we spend a lot of money demonising drugs. And there's all drugs. Except for alcohol that we actually promote and pump out at every opportunity. And finally, education programs. I would actually argue education programs for doctors are probably the least important of all these issues. We need to do them, but doctors and education, those other issues are actually bigger structural issues in terms of how we move forward. And on that point, I'll stop. Thank you.